Welcome to Office Hours. I'm Julian Zelizer of the Longview. I'm a little later than usual, and I only have about 20 minutes. I have to run to class. Just a busy morning, but it's great to be with you. A lot of going on in the news right now, obviously, especially in the Middle East. And please send in your questions via the chat. My article in Foreign Policy today came out this morning. It's actually in the origins of ICE after 9/11 in President Bush's counterterrorism program, and a little bit of a history of the major reorganization of national security that took place after 9/11 in 2002 and 2003, which included the creation of ICE. Don, War Powers Act, let's just get right to it. That will be part of the subject of my Longview newsletter tomorrow. I think this has been pretty significant, meaning there has been a long-term expansion of presidential war power that we have obviously talked about several times during office hours. But here we see a very clear effort in the build up to the attacks, to the war, whatever language we are going to use, and even through right now, where the president has pretty much circumvented the Congress, and there is going to be a vote on the War Powers Resolution. This is a resolution put into place in 1973 in response to the revelations of President Nixon and what was going on in Cambodia and a secret campaign there that escalated the war in Southeast Asia rather than clawing it back, which was what President Nixon had promised. And the War Powers Resolution created certain timetables whereby a president who used force would then have to um, request authorization from Congress, and after a certain amount of time, the authority would come to an end. All of this, it's like so much in our politics, is obviously predicated on Congress asserting its authority that it has been given. And it's been a checkered history since 1973. I do think it has not been as ineffective as some critics argue. I mean, even with President Bush and the very controversial buildup to the war in Iraq, there was still a request for authority from Congress to take military action. There was an effort to manipulate information, and obviously about weapons of mass destruction, but they were still approaching Congress. That is out the window right now. And what's even more stunning is obviously President Trump has a Republican Congress that has been very pliant to almost everything he wants. So there's no reason to think that that support might not have existed. So what we've seen now in many instances, the first bombing of Iran, Venezuela, and now this uh, very significant escalation, as we are watching in the news in real time, is a very important and brazen effort to really centralize war making in the presidency in a way that really brings us back to the early 1970s before this was passed. And so, that legislation is there, that power is there. And so we will see Democrats are calling for a vote on it, but again, that doesn't matter if the Republicans don't support it. And so, good question, Don. Why is ICE so brutal? I saw on the feed. Um, um, okay, we'll get to both questions. Well, I mean, part of the point of the piece was just the entire creation of the Department of Homeland Security with ICE is part of that. That takes place in 2002, and ICE is created in 2003 as an extension, was really a very, and we forget, notable and historic centralization of Homeland Security operations, the biggest that we had had since the early Cold War in 1947 with the National Security Act and the creation of the National Security Council and really the modern apparatus. And it had always been controversial to vest so much authority in federal power, but obviously in the aftermath of 9/11, and then after the midterms of 2002, there was a lot of political support to do that, and part of the reorganization was what was called the INS is dissolved, and it's replaced by ICE. And I think what has become apparent now is how that is used, how that power is used, really depends on the disposition of the president, who has a lot of authority via the executive branch over it. And it has not been as controversial as you might think, just given our history and reluctance to vest so much power in federal authorities. But I think in the last few months, very clearly, there is some realization of how did this agency come to be. And so you just have at a basic level that much power in one institution. A second part is a president who has been willing to use that very aggressively on the streets of New York. And third, there's another layer of this, which I feel like will become increasingly clear, although there's already investigative stories on it, that the training is really being done haphazardly. The goal is to recruit as many ICE agents as possible through the budget rather than to recruit, train, and make sure that they are effective. But that is not being done at this point. And so I think there's substantial evidence that a lot of the new agents are simply really not aware of how you interact with civilian populations, and some are beyond that, extraordinarily aggressive in their mentality about what they are doing on the streets and how they should conduct themselves. And obviously, you have statements by figures such as Stephen Miller being very clear that there is a blanket immunity, so to speak, for whatever the agents do, and that there's no right to engage in many kinds of traditional protests. So you take all of those and you add together the history and the here and now, and I think that's how we ended up in this situation. Obviously, I don't know how the war in Iran, to be honest, I was thinking of this in the morning, might impact the funding standoff over Homeland Security. But given the ramped up threat of terrorism that we are hearing in the news as one of the retaliatory moves by the Iranian regime, I don't know how that's going to affect Democratic calculations in the weeks ahead. But it's a very fascinating history of how this institution, and a great example, I think, as I think with my students, of how something so normal that if you just look at it from the perspective of 30 or 40 years as opposed to a 20-year time span is pretty remarkable. And that's what's been playing out on our streets. Please send in more questions along the chat. And yes, someone mentioned that this is a kind of ongoing issue since 1979, the famous Iran hostage crisis, which I think. So sorry, I was just reading the questions. I think, and I'll get to that, Trisha, in a second. I mean, I don't know this, but I suspect this looms large on President Trump's mind. Meaning this was the era he came of age, and for everyone from that period, 79, 80, into the 80s, Iran was really a focus of a lot of political debate. The Iran hostages crisis in 1979, after the Islamic Revolution, had been seen as a sort of humiliation for the United States. And this is a tension that I can't imagine doesn't inform some of how President Trump thinks of it. That's very different than I think I see a plan on what's going to happen. And you hear a lot of commentary that many people would be happy if the existing regime fell, and it's extraordinarily brutal. Brutal crackdown against protesters, anti-democratic, theocratic, that took place in January. But that doesn't mean there has there can't be a plan. There has to be a plan when you engage in an operation that of this level, which is so explosive in the Middle East. You're dealing with a regime that is deeply entrenched. It isn't a one-person regime. And as we've seen in previous wars with such as Iraq, it's the what happens after that matters more than, or at least as much as the initial operation. And so it's way too early to see how this is going to go. But we do know from American political history that without a clear strategy, you're unlikely to get much change. I mean, one option is the regime stays in place and President Trump cuts a deal, which doesn't lead to democratic reform, or in others, you have real instability and ongoing chaos, which could be extraordinarily dangerous. And there's no indication at this point that he has that plan. So I think. We will see. But I think the point raised in the comments on how entrenched the regime, it's different than even some of the other. I would argue it's even different than Hussein and the Iraqi regime back in the early 2000s. The detention centers is really. Someone mentioned the ICE detention centers are causing concern, and this is an extension of what we saw with the private carceral system in the 1980s and 90s, where there was a vast expansion all over the country. Often those were desired because they were located, private prisons, in areas that were underdeveloped economically, that had suffered during the 1970s as a result of the exodus of industry to southern states and increasingly overseas. And this might be playing out a little differently, which is interesting. I think the model is the same that we saw in that period, but you're seeing more communities that don't want these centers because of A, what they are, as seen by many as camps, which is different. Even as controversial as prisons are, I think that is different. And I think the context in which they are starting to expand very suddenly and rooted in this argument about how ICE should conduct its operations is very different than the law and order atmosphere than you saw in the 70s and 80s, which I think created more support initially from many communities for these facilities. So I do think I'm sorry I forgot who raised that point, but it will be a push and pull between that kind of opposition versus locating these and in communities that are desperate. And with prisons, with the private prisons in the 80s and 90s, what's the research shows pretty clearly is these became the industry of these communities. I mean, these were communities without factories, without service jobs. And so putting that there led to actual jobs, prison guards, for example. It led to secondary industry, restaurants, shops opening around the prison where the community running and administering the prison would do business. And so once they're there, they are actually pretty hard to dismantle. And I do think there'll be, as I think Don just said, there will be communities that want this for the money. It's the same kind of desperation for economic activity that we see in so many parts. So we'll see. There'll be a lot of push and pull, but I think locating them, I think all of you are correct, will be kind of a big political frontier. And obviously, also, as you know, that the money is escalating rapidly as a result of the big, beautiful budget bill, as it was called. And so that money is going to be spent very fast. That's my guess. And these will be spreading very, very quickly. So thank you for that question. That was an excellent question on that. Any more questions? And sorry, I'm just a little more rushed than usual because of class. So get them in, and I'm happy to answer. I assume Iran is on most people's minds. Yes, the language used for these, I think, matters a lot. There's a movie I recommend about prisons. It's about a prison in Alabama. It's nominated for the Oscar, and I am forgetting the title right now. If anyone remembers, please put it on the chat. I just saw it, and I highly recommend it. And some of the prisoners in this Alabama problem, maybe. If I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the title. Maybe some of you have seen it, where they had smuggled cell phones into the facility, which was just a brutal facility, and they really expose, what was going on in there, the treatment of the detainees, the conditions, which were really just inhuman, and a big contradiction with what public officials said and how they were being presented. The Alabama solution. Thank you, Lisa. And so I recommend seeing that, and I'm connecting that to the way in which people are talking about these ICE facilities, because I think the description is meant to be often bland, actually, as opposed to some of the detention centers overseas, which are meant to intimidate. But I think the more we learn about conditions inside, which include younger people who are being detained, I think that kind of exposure is very important right now as the buildup is happening, and it will impact how the politics play out on this. So, thank you. But I do recommend the Alabama Solution. It's a very well done film, and it gets into some of these issues, not with ICE. But with the prison system, with the power of the states over these systems, that's another layer. Obviously, these ICE facilities are run through federal power as opposed to state power, and that will be another dynamic. Look, all of this comes back to the story we were talking about a few days ago in this country on the midterms, and there's a huge primary taking place in Texas that I think everyone should follow. But those primaries and the midterms that come from them will dictate the balance of power. And should that power shift, I realize all the limits of what a Democratic House or a Democratic Congress could do, but some of these questions can be on the table in ways they are not right now. But that will play out. And yes, it will also be very interesting and important how Iran might impact the midterms. Traditionally, historically, foreign policy is not a huge issue in midterms. Midterm voters are really concerned about bread and butter issues. But given that history, I can imagine two elements of how this can have three ways it can have an effect. One is it simply sends a signal that the president is not concerned as much about issues of the family budget as he is with Iran, and a lot of his base voted for him because he would stay out of this. Secondly, it will focus attention, at least for now, and we'll see how long this goes on these kinds of questions rather than any kind of response to the affordability questions that Democrats are going to run on. And third, the way historically I think foreign policy can impact midterms is by just shaping how perceptions are of a leader and leadership skills of the head of a party. Midterms are obviously not an election of Trump, but they're a mandate about him. And so I think we've seen in 2002, for example, Republicans benefited from then a very strong perception of President Bush on national security. And there are many negative examples of that. So I think those are three ways to answer the question that this could turn into part of the mix. And now we're close. We're in the midterm season that this influences the elections. I'm going to have to run in a second. And I do want to talk more about this. Again, thank you, subscribers, for tuning in. And we will continue to have these conversations. Thank you, paid subscribers, for supporting the Long View. And as always, if some of you might consider becoming paid subscribers, that would be great to allow me to keep doing this project with you, especially in these times when I really believe that historical perspective, understanding U.S. Iranian relations since certainly 1953, 1979, is absolutely essential as we enter into this very dangerous moment and conflict, to understanding how this might play out, the issues at stake, and where this all comes from. So I'll be back soon and we'll talk. Look for my newsletter tomorrow on the war powers issue. And thanks for joining. Bye bye.